next, we turn tonight to the tension rising around the world as Russian President Vladimir Putin casts his shadow across the boundary of Europe and Russia. Tonight, his troops are holding firm in a corner of Ukraine known as Crimea. So will he push any further, and has the U.S. and its allies decided to push back?
His Air Force controls the skies. His army controls the roads, borders, and military bases. Putin rules in Crimea now.
Organizers said it was a meeting for nationalists. Critics called it a gathering of fascists and neo-Nazis. Protesters gathered on the street outside to voice their displeasure and wondered at the apparent contradictions in Kremlin policy. One protester who did not give her name said this country fought fascism.
Мне как бы нравится эта идея единой нации. Я хочу, чтобы нация была единая, чтобы один народ, одна страна, одна нация. Не то, что там как бы у Гитлера как было, но в своем вроде немножко, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация. Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Ukraine будет только для.
Stations have closed in Ukraine. Let's take a look at the exit polls there. The so-called chocolate king oligarch Pyotr Poroshenko has come out on top with almost 56% of the vote.
We are hearing from a group who calls itself Cyber Berkut. They say that they have hacked into the computers of the Central Election Commission and that they control the network. They say that they have infected it with a virus that will delete the counts and the final voting tally.
President Obama trying to get the world to stand united to prevent any future Russian incursions. And leaders have been focusing on that old ideological struggle between East and West. In that tussle, President Obama knows his European counterparts are more wary of broader economic sanctions against Russia, as they're not only neighbors, but consumers of Russian gas, goods and rubles.
Not an accident or a disaster, but an act of terrorism. Those were the words of the Ukrainian president today after a flight with 298 people on board was apparently shot down over his country.
4 hours into the flight, a burst of flame. Flight 17 took off from Amsterdam just after noon local time on its way to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The plane crossed into Ukraine, nearing Russia's border. That's when something went terribly wrong. It's unclear who fired the missile, but MH17 did fly over a war zone, the region below embroiled in conflict between Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government. That Russia has been providing air defense training to the pro-Russian rebels.
For any assistance we can to help determine what happened and why. And as a country, our thoughts and prayers are with all the families of the passengers, wherever they call home.
It's not our preferred outcome. These sanctions would not only have a significant impact on the Russian economy, but could also be disruptive to the global economy.
And successive rounds of Western sanctions, totaling tens of billions of dollars, have taken their toll on the Russian economy.
Russian officials are warning the response will be painful for the United States and heighten tensions between the two nations, levels not seen since the Cold War.
Our Russian banks, and now they're essentially shut out of doing business in the U.S. dollar. That's important. But you may have noticed that no, these sanctions are not those sweeping sectoral sanctions over big swaths of the Russian economy that the U.S. and others have been warning Russia about for months now. The U.S. has had a tough time getting Europe on board with sanctions like that. In response, Russia called these targeted actions evil and harmful to the U.S.
Breakthrough in Minsk as Putin announces a ceasefire deal following marathon talks to end the fighting in East Ukraine. Russian president said the truce would come into effect on Sunday and that the withdrawal of heavy artillery would take place over the next 2 weeks.
Russian former oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky is relaunching his Open Russia Foundation. His original charity, founded in 2001, aimed to promote openness and understanding between Russia and the rest of the world through various programs, including those in the fields of journalism, technology, leadership and culture. He more recently congratulated Ukrainians on holding a fair election and hopes one day Russia could do the same.
The chief executive of French oil company Total, Christophe de Margerie, has died in an air crash in Moscow. Witnesses said the plane burst into flames on impact. Wreckage was scattered up to 200 meters away from the initial crash site. Visibility was said to have been only 350 meters at the time. de Margerie had been in Moscow to attend a government meeting on foreign investment. With his outspoken manner and distinctive moustache, the 63-year-old was one of the most recognizable figures in the oil industry. He was a staunch defender of Russia and its energy policies amid the conflict with Ukraine. The French oil giant has been hit by the worsening relations between Moscow and the West.
The price of crude has fallen more than 40%. It's delivered the 1-2 punch to a Russian economy that was reeling from sanctions.
75% of its exports depend on oil and gas, so it's basically a petro-state. You have a petro-autocrat at the top of it, and so when oil prices fall, things tend to collapse.
As oil dropped, the Russian ruble fell in tandem. And a desperate round of central bank interest rate hikes failed to strengthen the currency. It hit record lows. Many Russians rushed to buy foreign imported goods as the ruble fell. So far, they're standing by Putin. The issue, of course, is for how long?
Pro-Russian separatists are holding elections in eastern Ukraine. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk are voting on severing ties with Ukraine. Russia has said it will recognize the result, but the contest has been denounced as illegitimate by Kiev, the European Union and the United States. Nonetheless, Alexander Zakharchenko, the leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, said nothing had been decided. "We will negotiate after the election," he said, and assess Kiev's position. "We have no incomes. My son doesn't work. He has a family of 5, this woman says. It's terrible. We have no pension." Many people, though, have fled the area because of the war, and some doubts are being raised about the validity of these elections with no official voting.
Muscovites are marching through the Russian capital. They're protesting against new healthcare and education reforms that threaten to close numerous hospitals and schools. Some marchers are calling for a return to the Soviet healthcare system.
In his end-of-the-year address, Russian President Vladimir Putin touched on a number of subjects, including the sanctions placed on the country by the West.
Speaking of sanctions, it's not just a nervous reaction of the US and their allies to our position on the coup in Ukraine, or even the so-called Crimean Spring. I'm sure that even if this did not happen, they would come up with another excuse to hold back Russia, to influence Russia, to use it in their own interests. I have not accidentally mentioned our American friends, as they always influence our relationship with our neighbors, direct or off the stage. Sometimes you don't know whom it's better to talk to governments or the countries, or directly to their American patrons and sponsors. I propose fixing the current tax conditions for the next 4 years, and not to come back to this question and not change them. Along with it, it's necessary to realize the decisions already made on alleviating the tax burden.
So all in all, a very ambitious speech, very ambitious plans, and President Putin called on people to stay united if Russia is to achieve these difficult goals.
At his year-end press conference, the Russian president said the pain would be temporary.
This situation could continue approximately, nobody can say exactly, for 2 years. The situation can improve sooner, even the first or second quarter of next year.
Putin says the Russian economy needs to diversify. That will take time. Russia needs a rebound in oil in 2050.